The 20th century swept in on a tide of progress. There were great advances in technology and communications. Popular newspapers and magazines, gramophone recordings, moving pictures seen at bioscopes and early picture houses created a new awareness of what was happening around the world. Transport of all types was at a key stage of evolution. Steam was being surpassed by electricity for public transport systems. The internal combustion engine demonstrated its versatility for private and public vehicles. In America, as in Europe, society was still class-ridden, the well-to-do wanting the middle and working classes to know their place. In the early years of the century, Britain was still building 50% of the world's merchant ships. Her shipbuilding and railway engineering were unsurpassed throughout the world, and her worldwide possessions made the British Empire, the greatest the world had ever seen, seemingly the empire on which the sun would never set. The most lucrative trading route was that with North America, and the North Atlantic became both the major sea route and the most important for passenger trade. At that time, there were no restrictions on emigrants from Europe entering the New World, and many thousands made the crossing. Britain was in competition chiefly with Germany to build the biggest, fastest and most luxurious liners, and so capture both the well-to-do travellers and the bread-and-butter emigrant trade. By 1906, Germany had both the largest liner, the Kaiserin August Victoria, at 24,581 tons, and the fastest liner, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, with a speed of 23.6 knots. Britain outshone them both in 1907 with the Cunard liners Lusitania and Mauretania, both at 32,000 tons and speeds of over 26 knots. They were built with subsidies from the Admiralty, who wanted to regain British prestige and prevent Cunard from being taken over by an American combine, the International Mercantile Marine Company, the IMM. The subsidy also meant the two liners could be adapted in time of war as armed merchant cruisers. Already under American financial control was the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, more popularly known as the White Star Line. Since the early 1890s, White Star had given up its quest to attain the fabled blue riband, which relied on the expensive and often uncomfortable luxury of high speed. Instead, a policy of comfort and safety was adopted, leaving the quest for speed to the other lines. With the takeover by IMM, cash was readily available for building even larger ships, and the advent of the Mauretania and Lusitania provided the spur for White Star to produce a series of ships that would dazzle the world. The American backing enabled the company to embark on an ambitious plan to produce a trio of liners to provide a weekly Atlantic service. They would be the largest, most luxurious and safest ships in the world, 50% larger than the Cunard giants. They were to be called Olympic, Titanic and Gigantic, the last eventually named Britannic. On July 1st, 1907, the order for the first two ships was placed with Harland and Wolff of Belfast. They were given the shipyard numbers 400 and 401. Major changes were needed at the Queen's Island shipyard. 3 existing slipways were demolished and 2 new ones laid in their place. These were straddled by a gantry, giving clear spaces of 100 feet between rows of supporting towers. The 840 feet long gantry was surmounted by a mobile crane, with a span of 135 feet and lifting capacity 3 tons. 6 mobile frames each carried 10 radial cranes, with lifts and ramps to transport men and materials to the various levels of construction. A large floating crane was purchased from Germany, and the construction of a new dry dock was commenced. The number of employees at the shipyard doubled to 11,300 during the building and fitting out of the two immense liners. The designer of the ships was Thomas Andrews. He was the nephew of Lord Pirrie, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, and was a well-connected member of Irish society. He worked with his deputy, Edward Wilding, using a drawing office full of draftsmen and a huge model of the proposed class of ship. The keel of the Olympic was laid on January the 1st, 1909, and that of the Titanic on March the 16th. The construction of the two massive hulls progressed apace, with the Olympic a few months ahead of the Titanic, to ease pressure on the shipyard production shops. On October the 20th, 1910, the Olympic was launched. She was painted grey to allow press photographers better views of the liner, and the launch took just 62 seconds. She was then towed to the new deep water quay for fitting out, leaving the black-painted Titanic still caged in her surrounding gantry. This is the Lido at Ruislip near London. It's hard to imagine now, but key scenes were made here for arguably the biggest British film of the 1950s. It was A Night to Remember. A Night to Remember remains the finest and most accurate film account of the Titanic disaster. And I'm here in London to talk to the film's producer, William McQuitty, who has personal recollections of the great ship herself.
My first contact with the Titanic was in 1911, when I saw a team of 20 draft horses struggling to pull one of the great anchors through the cobbled streets of Belfast, from the foundry down to the shipyards Harland and Wolff. And in the shipyard, this huge mountain of a ship was rising, and I watched her rise every day. And I said to my father, how on earth can they get this huge ship into the sea? And he said, they lay the keel on the slipway, and then they build the ship on the keel. And when the day for the launching comes, they grease the slipway with tons of tallow and train oil and soap, and they give the ship a gentle push, and the ship slides down to the water.
These new vessels were designed to have a service speed of 21 knots. The engines generated 55,000 horsepower. Cunard had opted for marine turbines to propel their record breakers, but Harland and Wolff adopted their favourite combination, reciprocating engines, to drive the two 23 feet 6-inch diameter outer propellers, the steam from which then exhausted into a low-pressure turbine which turned the ahead-only 16 feet 6-inch centre propeller. Providing steam for the engines were 24 double and 5 single-ended boilers containing 159 furnaces. 7 months after her launch, the Olympic was ready, and after 2 days of successful sea trials, she finally left Belfast on May the 31st, 1911. This was a brilliantly timed publicity exercise, as the Titanic herself was finally launched on the same day. For this occasion, the landward end of the building gantry was decked with 1 Union Jack and 1 Stars and Stripes, with a White Star pennant in the centre. below which code flags spelled out "Success."
The whole of Ulster was excited. This was the biggest ship in the world, and they're all excited about the launch. And everybody in the country turned up, and all the ships in the harbour, and there's a great crowd at the launching platforms, and 3 stands were erected round. And I remember the enormous noise. Maroons went off, rockets went off, and signals were given to stand clear. And just as my father said, the chocks were knocked away, and the hydraulic rams gave the gentle push, and I didn't believe it was going to move, and it didn't move for quite a long time. And then I felt suddenly that I was moving backwards, but of course it was the ship was moving forward. And it went faster and faster, and it was pulling, they had great tons and tons of anchor chain that were attached to the ship, so that to stop it gathering too much speed. And these chains made an enormous row, and they were dragged on, and the ship went into the sea with a tremendous splash, and all the sirens and everybody, and there was great rejoicing. And I felt very proud of this, and proud also that my birthday was the 15th of May, 1905, and this ship's launch was also in May, the 31st of May. So I had a great kinship for that ship.
About 100,000 people watched as, just after noon, the liner, urged on by hydraulic rams, slid backwards into the River Lagan. There was little ceremony, as was the White Star custom. Later, when the Britannic was launched, a retired shipyard worker recalled, "They just builds 'em and chucks 'em in." In just 62 seconds, she slid into the water and was brought to a halt by the tons of drag chains attached by cables along her hull. The following day, June the 1st, her sister ship anchored in the Mersey off Liverpool, the traditional home and port of registration of the White Star Line. It was her only visit to the Mersey, for then she headed for Southampton, the line's main port since 1907. Where the London and South Western Railway had built a new large dock to accommodate this new class of wonder ship, twice the size of the 20,000-ton liners the port had become used to. The dock, known as the White Star Dock until the late 1920s, is 1,700 feet long, 400 feet wide, enclosing 16 acres of water. It was later to be used by such liners as the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, and eventually the new QE2. Harland and Wolff had built a ship repair works at Southampton, but major repairs would have to be done in the new dry dock back at Belfast. The Olympic set sail on her maiden voyage at noon on Wednesday, June the 14th. Her captain was Edward John Smith, their premier Atlantic captain and destined for command of her sister ship. Also on board was J. Bruce Ismay, the company's managing director. He was preparing a meticulous report on the ship's layout, fittings and service, and many alterations to these provisions were subsequently made on the Titanic. The biggest changes were to be on Bridge Deck B, with luxurious parlour suites extending to the ship's side, thus removing the promenade for much of its length and increasing the gross tonnage by 1,004 tons. There was a reception hall by the aft grand stairway. A large restaurant with sea views, and a café parisien, complete with trellis work and growing ivy. Both ships had electric lifts. They had swimming baths, the first afloat, and there were Turkish baths, squash courts and gymnasia. But the Titanic acquired the reputation of being more luxurious because of the many improvements. Richly carved panelling, Stained glass windows, deeply piled carpets, and many other fitments of both luxury and necessity were bringing the Titanic to completion. She would be a floating palace. But completion, and ultimately the date of her maiden voyage, was delayed, owing to the return of the Olympic to Belfast following a collision near Southampton with the cruiser HMS Hawke on September the 20th. The Hawke's bow was badly damaged. The hole in the Olympic was 40 feet high and extended 8 feet into the ship. There was a second hole at the waterline caused by the cruiser's beak-like ram. Some witnesses claimed the huge bulk of the liner caused an undertow which sucked the smaller ship into her side. This phenomenon was later to cause a near accident on the Titanic's departure from Southampton. The Olympic was taken to the new dry dock at Belfast, and men were taken off from fitting out the Titanic to speed the repairs. On February 24, 1912, Olympic returned again for repairs to a propeller. Eventually, following these delays, and 11 months after her launching, the Titanic was at last ready for sea trials. One final modification had been to enclose and glaze her forward promenade on A deck. On Olympic, this section of promenade was prone to wetting by spray. This gave the Titanic a visual feature distinguishing her from her sister.
The other kinship I had for it was that I wanted to leave Belfast. I wanted to see the world. I'd been reading the Boys' Own paper and the Wide World magazine, and the one thing I wanted to do was to see the world. And I thought of this huge ship can escape as easily as this, then a little creature like me might manage to slip through and get out into the wide open world. That is what I wanted to do. We lived at Bangor, which is 12 miles from the shipyard, and there we watched the Titanic on her trials. And she went up and down the loch, and she was so big, she made the loch look small. It was almost like a toy ship on a toy sea. And I thought again, this Belfast loch connects this ship with every sea in the world, with every country in the world. And if I can get out, boy, I'm going to see them too. And then on the 2nd of April, 1912, we watched her go out for her first voyage.
Trials began on April the 2nd in the Irish Sea under the command of her captain, Edward John Smith, who left the Olympic in Southampton and travelled to Belfast. He'd taken his finest and final command and took the ship on to Southampton. In Southampton, the ship was thoroughly inspected by a Board of Trade representative. The brand new lifeboats were lowered and rowed around in the dock to the inspector's satisfaction before being hauled back on board. They were manoeuvred by the Welin type of davit, and although these could each handle several boats in succession during an emergency, the actual number of lifeboats fitted on the Titanic complied to a Board of Trade ruling made 20 years earlier. This stated that a ship of 10,000 tons or over, a large ship in the late 19th century, should carry 16 lifeboats. But Titanic was 46,000 tons. White Star in fact provided 4 extra in the form of Engelhard collapsible boats with planked bottoms and collapsible canvas sides. The number of passengers was not considered, just the letter of the law. In fact, this was only half the number of lifeboats required to accommodate a full complement of passengers and crew in the event of a disaster. Captain Smith was the White Star's senior captain. For many years he'd taken the White Star vessels on their maiden voyages. He was born on the 27th of January 1850 in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent. He was the son of Edward Smith, a potter and later a greengrocer, and Catherine Smith. He was educated at Etruria British School, one of the first day schools in the potteries. One of his first jobs was as a steam hammer operator at Etruria Forge. But he left the area at the age of 21 to join the mercantile marine. His progress was so swift that he captained his first ship when he was 24 years old. In an outstanding career, he eventually became commander and commodore of the White Star Line. His employers had absolute faith in his skill and judgment. His career had been unblemished by any accident, apart from the incident on the Olympic. He was a tall, distinguished, quietly spoken man, and coming up to retirement, the Titanic was to be the pinnacle of his career. Since January 1912, Britain had been in the grip of a coal strike, causing many liners to be laid up and putting 17,000 men out of work in Southampton. By April, the strike was on its last legs, but to enable the Titanic to set sail, coal had to be taken off other ships laid up in the docks, the White Star's Oceanic and Majestic, and the New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and St. Paul of the American line. On Wednesday, April the 10th, hundreds of passengers and crewmen boarded the Titanic. It was a bright, sunny day. The boat train from London brought the well-to-do, including the millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim and William Stead, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, who was going to America on the invitation of President Taft to deliver a speech at the World Peace Conference on April the 22nd. All levels of society were represented on this palace ship. Some lucky passengers were transferred from the laid-up IMM ships. At noon, the ropes holding the liner to the quay were cast off, and 6 tugs slowly pulled her away from the quay. There were cheers from the assembled crowd, the waving of handkerchiefs and the shouting of last-minute messages between ship and shore. The Titanic moved out into the River Test and began to move under her own steam, her 3 screws powerfully pushing her 46,000 tons slowly forward. But she displaced such an amount of water in the channel that the liner New York, moored alongside the Oceanic, broke her moorings and drifted out sternwards towards the great ship. Captain Smith and pilot George Bowyer stopped the central propeller and ordered the outer propellers to be set at full astern. This stopped the New York when she was only 12 feet from the Titanic's stern and brought the great ship herself to rest. The tug Vulcan placed herself between the vessels, had ropes thrown onto the New York, and, as the Titanic now moved backwards a little, towed the New York round the dockhead corner into the River Itchen and out of trouble. This near collision was seen by many as a bad omen, and put another, if only slight, delay in her departure. The liner proceeded down Southampton water. She passed Hythe to starboard, and Western Shore Netley, with its ruined abbey and huge military hospital, to port. She passed the mouth of the River Hamble, and finally rounded Cowshot Spit, and then into the Solent. In glorious sunshine, the Titanic sailed out past Cowes and the Isle of Wight and into the open sea towards Cherbourg. She was to arrive at 6:30 p.m. to take on more bags of mail and passengers. These included more millionaires, such as John Jacob Astor and his wife, and various socialites. Astor was one of the richest men in the world. Millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim was already on board. Major Archibald Butt was President Taft's aide-de-camp. Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Straus were there. They'd risen from a small business in Philadelphia to make Macy's a national institution. Many of these first-class passengers saw the maiden voyage of the Titanic as a good way to end their European holiday. Now she turned westwards through the English Channel to call at Queenstown, now Cove, in Ireland just before noon on April the 11th. More mail bags were taken on, and some mail and passengers delivered to the Irish port. Remaining on board the Titanic were 322 first-class passengers, 277 second-class, and 709 third-class, making her about half full, and 898 crew members. 3,814 sacks of mail had been loaded, and this would partly be sorted in the Titanic's own postbox. She weighed anchor at 1:30 p.m. and headed out into the Atlantic towards New York. Life on board an ocean liner consisted of eating and occupying one's time between meals as best one could. The first-class passengers had the ship's five-man band, led by Wallace Hartley, to entertain them. Hartley had previously played on the Mauretania and other prestigious liners. The band played everything from Strauss and Offenbach for the stately Jacobean room to ragtime and cakewalks for afternoon dances. A separate trio played in the restaurant's reception room and Café Parisien. A piano was provided for the use of third class, and an Irish piper and fiddler would play for their communal dancing. Ball games in the forward and aft well decks were popular with the third class. These could be seen by spectators from the other classes on the tiers of decks above them. These others had space enough for deck tennis, shuffleboard, or promenades round the wide boat deck. Inside, there were first and second class libraries and games rooms. To cater for over 2,000 people at sea for 6 days, head chef Mr. C. Proctor had stored in board 75,000 pounds of various meats, 25,000 pounds of poultry, including quail, pheasant, chicken, turkey and plover, 15,000 bottles of beer, 1,000 of wine, 1,000 pounds of tea, 2,200 pounds of coffee, and tons of fruit, vegetables, jams and other items. In third class, the food was basic but plentiful. People said that third class on the Titanic was as good as first class on any other liner. There were 2 dining rooms for first class, the Jacobean room and the à la carte restaurant with the adjoining Café Parisien, the latter 2 being run by Monsieur Gatti and his staff on behalf of the White Star Line. A bugler sounded the call for dinner in the evening. During the voyage, the weather remained fine, the sea calm, but with a chilling breeze. It was to get colder on Sunday, April the 14th. In the radio room, ship-to-shore contact was made possible again as the ship came in range of Cape Race, and the operators were kept busy with current messages and the backlog which had built up through a breakdown of the system 2 days before. Ice warnings had been received during Sunday by the two Marconi operators in the radio room, Jack Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride. Their prime job was to transmit and receive private messages, known as Marconigrams, stock exchange information and news, these private messages bringing the company its revenue. Official messages received for the ship indicated that there was pack ice and large and small icebergs in the shipping lanes, although it wasn't appreciated that these warnings represented one huge ice field. Messages to the ship itself were pinned on a notice board for the information of the navigating officers, but not all the ice warnings were posted. An 11 a.m. warning had read, "America passed two large icebergs in 41 degrees 27 minutes north, 50 degrees 8 minutes west on the 14th of April. A message received from the Masaba at 9:40 p.m. stated, "Ice report in latitude 42 degrees to 41 degrees 25 minutes north, longitude 49 degrees to 50 degrees 30 minutes west. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice. Weather good, clear." Assistant Operator Harold Bride was off duty, but Chief Operator Jack Phillips was snowed under with sending and receiving private messages. He put this later message to one side for subsequent delivery to the bridge. He was not to know that this message warned of ice directly in the path of the Titanic. At 11 p.m., the Leyland liner Californian was not far away, stopped and blocked in by ice. During the course of the evening, Phillips had rebuked the Marconi operator on the Californian for interrupting his calls to Cape Race. Later, as he came off duty, the Californian's wireless operator switched off his set and turned in for the night. Captain Smith had been to a dinner party held in his honour in the restaurant. He returned to the bridge at 9 p.m. He discussed the weather and ice warnings with Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller. After 20 minutes, he went into the chart room, leaving instructions for him to be called if conditions deteriorated. Lightoller went off duty at 10 o'clock, handing over to First Officer Murdoch. Lightoller went to bed just before 11:30 after making his rounds of the ship. Up in the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were looking ahead in the bitterly cold wind. At 11:40 p.m, Fleet rang the crow's nest bell 3 times and picked up the telephone connecting him with the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead," he called. He described what he saw. The berg came ever closer. The ship then responded to Murdoch's emergency instructions. Harder starboard, full astern, harder port. The prow swung slowly across and the iceberg passed along the starboard side of the ship before disappearing aft. It seemed like a near miss. But the iceberg had bumped along the ship's hull below the waterline, shearing off rivet heads, penetrating parts of the hull, and opening overlapping plate seams. A series of punctures over some 300 feet had been made below the waterline along the front part of the starboard hull. The whole impact had taken only 10 seconds. Many people on board didn't even notice the event. Others reported feeling a slight vibration. Some people came up on deck to see why the ship was now stopping, and on the third-class deck men were seen playing football in the forward well deck with some of the ice which had fallen from the towering berg as she passed. There was no clue to the imminent disaster. Captain Smith had rushed to the bridge and checked that all the electrically operated emergency watertight doors below had been closed, and he ordered a quick inspection of the ship. It was only then that the enormity of the damage to her hull became apparent. The Titanic was divided into 16 watertight compartments and can float with any 2, possibly 3 or 4 of them, completely flooded. But this long, glancing blow meant that the 6 forward compartments were flooding. The bulkheads this far from the prow only reached up to the saloon deck, some lower still, and as the ship was weighed down with the seawater flooding in and began to sink by the head, the water would rise above these compartments to fill the next, and so on. It was inevitable that the Titanic would sink. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, confirmed this to Captain Smith, but still the passengers were unaware of their imminent peril.
I'd been in my berth about 10 minutes when I felt a slight jar, but it was not sufficiently large to cause any anxiety to anyone, however nervous they may have been. The engines, however, stopped immediately afterwards. I went up on deck in my dressing gown, and I found only a few people there who'd come up in the same way to inquire why we had stopped. But there was no sort of anxiety in the mind of anyone.
Now gradually began the general alert. Runners called through the ship for passengers to put their life jackets on and proceed up onto the decks. Some still thought this was merely a safety practice, even at near midnight. What distinguished this operation in its early stages was the quiet orderliness, with people remaining, on the whole, quite calm. It was a cold, clear, starlit night as people filled the decks, those in the upper classes arriving before the great numbers of third-class passengers who were berthed furthest away from the boat deck. The sea was a flat calm, but Captain Smith knew there would only be enough space in the lifeboats for half the people on board. Down in the Marconi room, the captain ordered the operators to stand by, then returned a few minutes later at 12:15 a.m. to tell them to send the International Distress Call CQD. The position was estimated as 41 degrees 46 minutes north, 50 degrees 24 minutes west. At 12:25, this was changed to 41 degrees 46 minutes north, 50 degrees 14 minutes west. The revised signal being picked up by the liner Carpathia, nearly 60 miles away. She immediately altered course and steamed towards the stricken giant. Just after 12:30, Captain Smith again came to the wireless room and asked what they were sending. CQD, Phillips replied. Harold Bride joked, "Send SOS. It's the new call. It may be your last chance to send it." Shortly after, the first lifeboat was lowered, containing only 19 or 20 people. The early boats had many spare places in them. But then Quartermaster Lowe began firing off distress rockets at 5-minute intervals, and people were now less reluctant to climb into the lifeboats being prepared for lowering. The evacuation of the ship now ceased to be so calm and orderly. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, had been playing inside the liner. Now they moved out onto the deck and, almost incongruously, played jaunty ragtime tunes. As each lifeboat reached the water, it moved away from the ship for fear of the suction should she sink. Some rowed towards the lights of a ship, which could be seen just a few miles away, but this ship was never properly identified and never reached. The Titanic's bow sank lower and lower in the water, yet all her lights remained ablaze throughout until very near the end. With great courage, every one of the liner's engineers stayed at his post in the bowels of the ship to keep the pumps, lights, wireless, and other functions operational. Women and children first was the rule for the lifeboats, but some men were allowed in as boats were hurriedly lowered and no ladies could be seen close by. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of White Star, himself stepped into a partially filled boat. For this he was to be shamed throughout his life. First and second class passengers were led to the boat deck. Third class had to find their own way as best they could. Many steerage passengers were still locked into their quarters by the barrier gates that enforced strict class distinction. At 1:40 a.m. the last rocket was fired. The last of the rigid lifeboats was lowered at 1:55. The boat deck now only 15 feet above sea level instead of her usual 62 feet. 2 of the collapsible boats were successfully launched. A third was launched at 2:05, by which time the forecastle was under water and Promenade Deck A was awash. At about this time, Thomas Andrews, who'd designed this great ship, was last seen standing in the first-class smoking room. He was standing, arms folded, life jacket off, staring straight ahead at a painting above the mantelpiece, The Approach to Plymouth Harbour, by Norman Wilkinson. Captain Smith released the wireless operators from their duties, but Phillips carried on sending distress messages while the power held out. The captain then walked along the deck, telling his men, "It's every man for himself." Incredibly, the lights still burned. At 2:10 she lurched and sank deeper. The last collapsible lifeboat and some men were washed off the deckhouse, and this lifeboat B landed upside down in the water, with no chance of righting it. Men clambered to at least stand on the upturned hull. The band now played a solemn air. Some say autumn, but popular belief says it was Nearer, My God, to Thee. Now the stern rose out of the water. 2 4-inch diameter cable stays snapped, and the forward funnel crashed down to starboard, crushing the bridge wing and killing several people in the water. The wash it generated pushed the upturned lifeboat away from the ship. There were varying reports on how Captain Smith met his end. One claimed he committed suicide on the bridge with his revolver. Another that he swam up to a lifeboat with a baby in his arms, put the baby in the boat, then sank beneath the waves. And another that he simply went down with his ship. Perhaps he too had been killed by the collapsing funnel. But others say he swam towards the upturned collapsible lifeboat before turning away and disappearing in the darkness. 1,500 people were still on board as now the bridge submerged. The stern rose higher in the air. Those in the lifeboats heard the terrible crashing sounds as boilers broke loose from their seatings and crashed down through the vessel, along with many tons of coal, baggage, and all the loose furniture and fittings of the great ship. At the same time, her lights went out, flashed once more, and then were finally extinguished. Now the ship broke her back, and at least 100 feet of her stern rose to a near vertical position, which she held for a considerable time, silhouetted against the stars on the calm, clear night. The visible part of the ship apparently settled back slightly, before it, too, disappeared beneath the sea. It was this settling that indicated the ship had broken in two. Now there was nothing to do but wait for rescue. Among those standing on the upturned boat was Harold Bride, the wireless operator, who confirmed to his companions that the Carpathia was on her way. Just 50 minutes after the Titanic sank, the Carpathia was sighted on the horizon, firing rockets, and at 4:30 she was on the scene. The Carpathia arrived with the dawn. One by one, the lifeboats drew alongside the Carpathia. Survivors had to climb up a rope ladder into a loading bay in the side of the ship. Children, unable to do this, were put into sacks, placed into cargo nets, and hauled up onto the deck. 705 people were taken on board, and many desperately searched for family members who may also have survived. Hope turned to despair for most. En route to New York, Captain Rostron only allowed official and personal messages to be sent from the ship by radio. Newspapers, thus denied hard copy, made up their own fanciful accounts of the disaster. It was only on arrival that the true story became known. Memorial services were held on both sides of the Atlantic, while the crew were detained under virtual arrest until the official inquiries were carried out, their pay having been stopped from the moment of sinking. Controversy reigned over who was to blame, and whether the nearby ship, the Californian, could indeed have rescued everyone on board if only her wireless operator hadn't closed down his set 20 minutes before the collision with the iceberg. The lookout certainly saw and counted the rockets, but thought these might have been company signals, used for identification purposes on ships still not fitted with radio. And they also appeared to be too low for a ship reportedly so near. The American inquiry placed blame for the disaster on J. Bruce Ismay, the fact that the Titanic was sailing at virtually full speed, 21 knots, at the time of the collision, knowing there were icebergs in the area, and the lack of sufficient lifeboats. The English inquiry also cited Captain Smith. As a result of the tragedy, 4 positive steps were taken to ensure maximum safety in the Atlantic. All ships were to have lifeboat places for all on board. There should be lifeboat drills on every voyage. There should be 24-hour radio watch, and international ice patrols for the North Atlantic shipping lanes. 63% of Titanic's first-class passengers had survived, 42% of second class, and 25% of third class. 23% of the crew were saved, 705 in all, leaving 1,500 to perish in the icy seas of the North Atlantic. The tragedy had repercussions around the world, but soon there were greater concerns as Europe was plunged into World War I. And soon both the great Lusitania and Titanic's new sister ship, Britannic, were sunk by enemy action. Down the years, the Titanic disaster became a distant memory. It wasn't until after the Second World War that interest was revived by author Walter Lord, whose work was to be the basis of William McQuitty's feature film about the Titanic.
The war started, and I joined the Ministry of Information, and I made documentary films. But all the time, I was thinking about the Titanic and what a wonderful film this would make. The opportunity occurred when my wife, Betty, brought back Miranda, our youngest child, from Queen Charlotte's Hospital, together with a review of Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember. Now, no film can be better than its script.
I wish I knew how my interest in the Titanic began. I really have no idea. I just have always been interested in it. I think it's when I was 9 years old, I was interested in the Titanic. I think perhaps it has something to do with the way little boys catch cold. Nobody knows how they do it, they just do. I think the same thing with my interest in the Titanic. I had finished a book on our Civil War, and I was looking for another project. I thought perhaps about the Civil War again. And my editor, who was a chap I'd worked with in OSS in London, said, again, you were always talking about the Titanic, why don't you write a book about it? So I began doing it, but I'd done most of the research just to satisfy my own curiosity. When I went to Princeton, other people went to the library to study the classics or French or something, that I went to the library to look at the old newspapers on the Titanic. I also found the hearings there, the American hearings, and that's such a wonderful, unexplored treasury of material on the ship that I gobbled that up too while I was at it. And then I was pretty much ready to write about the subject whenever it happened. I was ready without knowing it. I worked out my outline of my book, chapter by chapter. I then wrote a draft, and then the time my editor felt was that was the time to get in touch with the survivors, when I knew as much as I was ever going to know without them. And so I then began a sort of blitzkrieg of getting in touch with survivors. And it was difficult in a way because there was no Survivors Association at the time. There was no Titanic Club. There was no Titanic interest, really. But nothing had been written on it for 40 years, not since 1913. And so it was a challenge just to find them. And I didn't have much money. I worked in the advertising business at the time as a writer. My solution was to write letters to the editor and ask editors of various newspapers to place these letters in their letters column. And I tried to pick the cities where there might be most survivors from what I knew. For instance, Chicago was a place where a lot of them were going, who were going to settle in the Middle West of our country. New York was an obvious place. Some of the most prominent came from Philadelphia, so that was another place. Then there were the Belfast papers. Of course, she was built in Belfast. And then there were the London papers, the British papers. And then, of course, the Southampton Echo and those coastal papers. I sent barrels of these letters out, each of them informal and personal, not just a form mimeographed letter. I sent them a personal letter to the editor and asked them whether they would run it. And an amazing number did. And then the survivors, the letters said to get in touch with me at my New York address, and then they began writing in. And then, of course, once you got a few of them, they would lead to others. And in the end, I had over 64, I think. But that was the way it was done. And on a very low budget of just a number of postage stamps, I managed to get in a very rich harvest of Titanic survivors. It just came to me. I can even show you the spot in the city of New York where inspiration suddenly came to me. This book should be called A Night to Remember. It was at the corner of 38th Street and Park Avenue, if you don't want to go there. There were certain people in the publishing business, however, who thought that all you've got to write about is the Titanic. How can you not put the Titanic on the cover? The Night to Remember that was published here it has a picture of the ship on the cover. It doesn't explain who she is. It's just running right at the iceberg. In Britain, they weren't as brave. Longmans Green, who did a beautiful job of publishing it and promoting it, nevertheless on the jacket, they call it A Night to Remember, and there's no subtitle or anything, but there is a life ring which says Titanic on the life ring, which is going down into the sea. So they got around my prohibition that way.
A Night to Remember had its premiere in Leicester Square Theatre. It was a wide success. It got the finest reviews that any film ever got. It was the best film and the most expensive that the Rank organization had ever made. And I was sent off to America to open it there.
The survivors were brought to New York by the J. Arthur Rank Company for the premiere of the film, which was here on Times Square, one of the big movie theaters. I had a chance to meet them and to talk with them that day, and they seemed, to me, it was a gold mine come true to have so many of the survivors right here. Incidentally, while I found maybe 64 survivors, I think the J. Arthur Rank Company found, Bill McQuitty found another 70. And so the survivors list kept growing and growing and growing. And then after the film came out, still more survivors popped up. I think we must have been in touch with just about everybody by the time the film was made.
We got rave reviews in America. We got the Golden Globe Award, their top award. And we got other awards, and Christopher Award and several others. And there's no doubt about it that the people who understand films accepted it as being a terrific film. This is not just another shipwreck. This is an end of an era. The steerage passengers paid £12. The stateroom passengers paid £875. This is for a 5-day trip. She was the biggest ship in the world. She was brand new. She was never called Unsinkable by Halden Wolves, but Unsinkable was the pattern that followed her. And the arrogance of the people on board, the arrogance of the difference between £875 and £12 for a 5-day voyage. They weren't paying this extra money because they got all that difference in accommodation of food. They were paying it because they were arrogant. They traveled first class. And today many of these ships have got one class. I mean, the people in the steerage were people and should have been accepted as such. And this is coming now. Now this was the beginning. This was the end of the era of this idea that by paying money or dressing up in fancy clothes, you could be superior to someone else.